This is the first in a series of briefings on election issues that we're running at the Religion Media Centre, and we're looking at how religion is part of the election story. Today we have a number of top experts in the room, and we're looking at education. And the idea, because there are many issues that have come up in the various manifestos, is that we'll run through each topic in turn and ask for members of the panel to address each one. But we're going to start with Paul Bickley, Head of Political Engagement at the Theos think tank. Paul, I wonder if you can just set this in a bit of context for us, please. If I can ask you how high education is on the lists of issues that the public are interested in, and what does the data tell you about how faith is enmeshed in the education system?
Well, thank you, Ruth. It is not seen, generally speaking, as a key election priority issue. So usually the key election priority issues amongst the general public are the economy, NHS and immigration. If you begin to break the population down differently and look at different groups, they prioritize different things. Of course, that's quite natural. It's worth bearing in mind that for any parent, anybody with school-aged children, then education will obviously be a priority, but other people will think of it a little bit less. But I think the statistic is, I think about 14% of voters say that it's their priority issue. So it's an important issue, but not in the top, at the top of the league, so to speak. When it comes to religion education in the UK, obviously there's a long history and a lot of integration in some senses. There are still around 7,000 state-funded faith schools in England, and that's England alone. That is a significant number. The majority of those, Church of England, the majority of those are primary. Obviously, there's a lot to say about the independent sector and the integration there, which I'm sure you'll come on to look at. So primarily an integration between church provided education or church institutions in the education system. If you look at other religions, then the combined they do have state-funded education institutions, but they make up less than 1% of all state-funded mainstream schools. But there are growing numbers of schools which have a Sikh ethos, a Hindu ethos, and a Muslim ethos.
So you've done an analysis of the British election study, and you've looked at how the vote has been shared between people of different faiths, how they voted in previous elections. What does the data tell you about how people have voted when it comes to education?
Yeah, so the BAS, which is a large multi-wave survey, it's an academic survey. It's not, as it were, a market research survey, but it's an academic survey, and it has relevant questions on how people think about education. One of the questions we looked at was how people perceive the current government's handling of education. By and large, it's people are pessimistic about the current government's handling of education. Religious nons are the most pessimistic, but that's the margins are relatively small. The most enthusiastic group is the Muslim group, and 15.4% of Muslims, albeit on a small sample, say that they're content with what the current government have been doing, whereas the lowest group is the nons, who say 7.9% are happy with the government's approach to education. And the other groups are sort of in between that. But there are a couple of other interesting points. When you ask respondents about their feeling about local education provision, then Christians are hugely more positive than any other group in the population. So more than half of them are positive about local provision, where if you look to the Muslim community, then it's 34.8% or 35%. So there's a clear difference there. Muslim respondents feeling less positive about local education provision. There was one thing that will be relevant for the public debate around education, which is largely focused around private schools, strangely, in this election campaign. Muslim respondents are far more likely to be sending their children to private schools than other respondents. So about a third of Muslim respondents said that they will be sending their children to a private school, or have sent their children to a private school at some point in the past. So there's something to be said there about, well, what are the kind of parents, what are the kind of people that are looking for private education? And of course, you then have to ask the question, why? The group least likely to be looking for private education are the religious nons. And again, other groups in between, with Christians at just less than 20%, other religions just more than 20%.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. It's very interesting. And we have Ashfaq Chowdhury, the chair of the Association of Muslim Schools, on the call. So we'll ask you to respond to that in a moment, Ashfaq. But perhaps we can start looking at the issues now. And let's start with faith schools. So in May, the government announced a consultation on lifting what's known as the 50% admissions cap for faith schools, which limited the number of places that can be given to children from a particular denomination. In fact, the consultation closes this Thursday, but it's all been caught in this mid-air purdah now that the election's been called. We're joined by Professor John Lydon and Dr. Caroline Healy from St Mary's University in Twickenham. John, perhaps I can ask you first of all, you must be very disappointed because you were campaigning for a lifting of this cap for years. And finally, just as you thought it was going to happen, the election is called. So great disappointment, I would think.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Colleagues, yes, indeed. We should say at the outset and make clear that Dr. Caroline Healy and I are representing the Catholic Union today, so we're not speaking officially on behalf of the university, which I think is important to make clear at the outset. And as Ruth has quite rightly said, this campaign has been ongoing for the last 14 years, apparently. We were, as she says rightly, we were particularly pleased that it was about to be lifted, especially in the context of parental rights and their rights to choose a faith education, if you like, or a school with a religious character for their children. So we saw it as discrimination so far as, only 50% could go, particularly in areas where there is genuine need. The one thing I'd say is that the Conservative manifesto, of course, was committed to lifting it. The Labour one doesn't mention it as far as we can see. And we're wondering now, of course, if a Labour government is elected, as the government following the general election, we are not sure, obviously, whether or not this commitment on the part of the Conservatives to lift the cap is, whether they'll honour that. Before I ask Caroline, if I could just say something, we've got 5 priorities, but I don't want to hog the conversation. Obviously, everybody has the right to, kind of share their views. But we genuinely feel that in terms of schools with a religious character in general, the campaign has exposed just how hostile some groups are to religion having any role in education. And we've noted that particularly from the National Secular Society and the Humanist UK. As far as we can see, none of the parties seem to have said anything about this. There is no mention of faith in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. However, Keir Starmer, in an interview with the Jewish News, I'm just reading this, he says, "I think it's good that we create strong bonds between schools, and therefore I wouldn't tinker with it the way that we run our faith schools." And that was an interesting point. His last point put me on a bit of inquiry, though. He said, "You don't interfere with the model of a faith school, but you build a broader framework around it." So what he might mean by that, we might share in this conversation.
I wonder at that point if I could bring in Rizal Friedman. You're the Assistant Director of the Partnership for Jewish Schools. Just had that quote from the Jewish News quoted there. How will this cap, or will the cap, affect you in any way? And what are your main concerns going into the election?
Hiya, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here with everybody. I think what's been most striking from all the manifestos is the emphasis on education. And I know we heard some quite poor statistics about how people view the importance of education when it comes to vote. But obviously for us at Pages, partnerships with Jewish schools, we support Jewish schools across the UK. This is obviously our key area of interest and work. The removal of the faith cap of the 50% cap was going to be something really important for all Jewish schools in the independent sector who are considering moving into the state sector, because at the moment there really isn't a mechanism to set up a faith school that is 100% faith-based. As we all know on this call, I think a third of the schools in our country are faith schools. And ensuring that we have that continued high quality provision, the ability for parental choice is really important and really key for our community, for our society, across the UK. I think, and I know that this leads over into the next topic, so I apologise for preempting it, Ruth. But the key concern for us at Pages at the moment, when looking at the manifestos, one of the main issues is the Labour proposal for the implementation of VAT on school fees.
We will come on to that, Russell, in a minute. But just to stick to this particular area, which is the cap, can I go to Ashfaq Chowdhury? Ashfaq, you're the chair of the Association of Muslim Schools. Does lifting the cap affect your network of schools in any way?
Well, Ruth, in practice, it doesn't necessarily affect our schools. It's purely because the percentage of pupils that go to state-funded Muslim schools is incredibly low. We have about 37 schools now in the state sector compared to, you look at the Muslim population. So what tends to happen, that 50% lifting of the 50% cap in reality is not necessarily going to benefit those schools. The only benefit that could be is in the future, if that cap allowed for some of the independent schools, like my colleague mentioned, to go into the state sector. But as of now, it's not necessarily going to make a real change on the ground.
Thank you. Can I bring in Steve Chalke now? Steve, you're the founder of the Oasis Trust and you run many schools. Perhaps you can give us an idea of the scope of it all. But can I ask you just a broader question on whether, how you would define a faith school, whether there is a need for faith schools and whether it implies that faith is absent from secular schools. How do you read what's going on, the kind of parental, not requirement, but desire for faith schools and their continuing success?
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everybody. Yes. Well, first of all, we run 54 schools. That's 54 ordinary state schools, primary or secondary or all through. But then we got a very special school that we've just started running, the country's first secure school, which is for young people who would have otherwise been sentenced to a youth jail like Feltham, but instead of going to a judge will send them to Oasis Restore. So it's a school, but it's secure. None of our schools are designated as faith schools, but that does not mean that faith isn't very, very, very important to them. In fact, not just important, but the central plank on which they're built. We talk about our ethos and our values being Christ-centered. I am a Baptist minister myself, but our schools are available to all. So our mission is to serve the community in which we're placed. How close is your front door to our front door? So it's not dependent on whether your parents happen to go to a church or a mosque or anywhere where else. We want to be completely inclusive. But for us and for our ethos, we see that inclusion as part of whom we're called to be as a Christian organization, accepting, celebrating all. How close is your front door to our front door? Obviously, siblings, looked after kids with special medical needs as well. So though we're not designated as schools of religious characters, spirituality is core to everything we do in terms of our ethos, our values, and our curriculum and how it works out for our staff and their growth and understanding. Although we employ people from all sorts of backgrounds, religious backgrounds and no religious background. But what we talk about is spirituality, because what we would say is this: in order to achieve in life, in order to fulfill your potential, to become the best version of yourself, to be equipped for life, the inner journey is as important as the outer journey. In fact, we bemoan the fact that faith has been linked to religion, when of course religion, the word religion comes from the Latin, is the same root as the word ligament, and our ligaments are connecting. So religion or spirituality, the task of religion was always there to connect us to ourselves, to others, and to God. And a lot more stuff has grown up around that. We want to strip it back and talk about that. That's us.
When you say that it's not overtly Christian, your schools are not overtly Christian, how does the whole school community, the staff and the children, how do they know that Christianity is the ribbon that runs through your school? Do you ever kind of verbalise it in any way?
We verbalise it all the time. In fact, it's verbalised first of all in our badge, which is the messy circle of Oasis. We call it the O of Oasis, and it has many stranded. So we talk about all faiths. We talk about, we employ many Muslim staff. We employ many Christian staff, etc., etc., etc. But what we've worked through is an ethos and a set of values that impregnate and permeate every aspect of our school's life, every aspect of our organisation's life. It starts with the backroom services, doesn't it? So we have an HR department centrally and an IT department, etc., etc., etc. A finance department, as you'd expect. But people are always surprised if you walk around our central offices and we introduce them to our ethos and theology department. And they say, well, why do you need one of those? For the same reason as you need a finance department. Because we always say the way you spend your money is in direct line with what you really believe and how it works out. So for school assemblies and lessons, etc., we have as much curriculum around all of these things as we do around maths and English or anything else.
Right, that's a nice segue into the next section, actually, Steve. Thank you. The way you spend your money. We're going to be talking about private schools now with Rudi Eliott Lockhart, the Chief Executive Officer of the Independent Schools Association. And Rudi, one of the headlines of education in this campaign is that Labour will slap VAT on private school fees. I wonder if you could give us an example of what this might mean for schools that you look after within your section, because you don't look after all independent schools, do you? It's just a section of them.
Yes, of course. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and great to see everyone else here. So to try and give a little bit of context, there's just under 2,500 independent schools in England, and it's an incredibly diverse sector. So a lot of the public debate is dominated by images people have of, frankly, maybe one or two independent schools. And the reality is much, much more complicated. And I run an association that has 660 heads. So it's a subset of the sector as a whole. And my heads tend to be running some of the more diverse types of independent schools, not the more traditional ones. So in terms of religion and those schools, overall, there is a higher proportion of independent schools tend to be faith schools than in the state sector. But it's again a very complicated picture. Sorry, I will get to the VAT point on this, don't worry. So you've got, particularly with the Christian schools, there's a lot that were established as Christian schools, sometimes quite some time ago, over 100 years ago. And many of whom now wear their religion quite lightly. It doesn't mean that there aren't still some really important parts of religion within those schools for those people who want that. But in some ways, the schools can feel quite secular today. At the same time, there are an awful lot of independent schools where religion is really important to their character. And that's particularly true with some of the Muslim independent schools and the Jewish independent schools, but also for some Christian independent schools that are serving a very particular community. And so it's complicated across the sector.
Just to butt in there at a moment, Rudi, what are you hearing from schools, including the religious schools, about their fears if this policy comes in? How many have told you that they're going to go to the wall?
There's real anxiety. Adding 20% VAT to the fees is going to have a huge impact on lots of schools. These are schools that have gone through a really difficult time. Schools and parents gone through a difficult time with the cost of living crisis, energy crisis, impact of COVID. So there's not capacity to absorb additional costs either for parents or for schools. So in many cases, there will be schools that simply won't be able to continue to operate, and I'm really concerned about that. It'll happen particularly with the smaller, more financially fragile schools, which are often some of the ones with the strongest religious characters, where they're meeting a need that isn't met in the state sector in the same way. Sometimes these will be schools on much lower fees than the average. So we tend to see that schools with a religious character in the independent sector, if you step away from those that I mentioned earlier, where the religion is worn quite lightly these days, which are sometimes quite high fee schools, these other religious schools are relatively low fee schools, so sometimes with fees of under £10,000 a year, often under that. And while that might mean that they're lower fees, it means that the types of parents who are choosing that are more likely to be under more financial pressure. So if you put the 20% on for them, it's going to have a disproportionate impact there. So we're worried about what that means for, effectively for religious freedom, that this is part of parents being able to choose the school that meets their requirements. And if it's not met in the state sector, that's a real concern.
Thank you. Can I bring in Rizal Friedman? You wanted to say something about this earlier, Rizal, and then perhaps Ashfaq and anyone else who'd like to come in after that.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Absolutely. The recent DFE figures estimated that about 10% of all schools across the country are independent schools, and in the Jewish sector, we have about 140 Jewish schools across the UK, and 60% of them are independent schools. And exactly as Rudi was pointing out, their fees are nowhere near the ranges that you would get in some of the Eatons of the world. They range between £5,000 and £10,000 at maximum, and the impacts of a family who, for religious reasons, can only choose their local independent school because that is the only school that caters to their unique religious needs, means that there isn't another location for them to go to. We can quibble about whether or not the state system currently has capacity for any schools that might close down, but in the Jewish sector, there are no state schools for these children to go to, which means that a Labour government would need to create extra capacity, create new schools for these children, and the impact on the public purse would be quite extreme. At Pages, what we've estimated is, looking at the ESFA amounts that are allocated on a per pupil basis, considering pupil premium amounts as well, capital costs that are given to schools on a per pupil basis, it costs the state somewhere between £8,000 and £10,000 to educate a child. It would therefore be reasonable to ask Labour, if they come into power, to perhaps create a cap of £8,000 to £10,000 per child, because in the Jewish sector, we will have about 20,000 students who will require places in the state system where none exist. And the other thing we would also hope is that there's an equalities impact assessment, because again, as Rudi points out, this will disproportionately impact the entire faith sector, not just the Jewish sector. And that is an absolute, minimum request that we would have for Labour when assessing the impact of this particular policy.
Thank you, Rizal. Can I bring in Ashfaq? Do you have any contribution here about the impact on your schools?
Very much similar what my colleague just mentioned just now. We're incredibly concerned about schools in our sector. In fact, our average fees are even lower. The average fee for a Muslim school, we estimated based on our research, is about £3,000 per annum, which is much lower than pretty much all sectors at the moment. If VAT is imposed on these schools, there's a great risk to the largest majority of them. So there's about 150 plus Muslim independent schools in this country. The largest majority of them would actually put them in a very, very difficult position where trustees will have to think about shutting those provisions. Overall, we estimate an approximately 30,000 young people will have to then be pushed across to the state sector. There is no like-for-like school because we don't have state-funded schools. There's only about 37. So there is no way that's going to be absorbed. What is going to happen is that the public purse will have to pick up at least about 30,000 students at £10,000, like my colleague estimated. You can work out the figures yourself. Not only that, there's going to be a disproportionate sort of impact on choice, the freedom for choice for all parents. So we are totally concerned.
Yes, I was just going to add to what's been said, take just a slightly different approach, but I think it ends up in the same place. I talk to, we don't run any independent schools, work in the state system, but I talk to parents all the time who do send their children to private schools. And all of those parents that I know send them there because in a classroom of 30 children, if their child is an atypical learner, if they have special educational needs, learning difficulties, if they're neurodiverse, in that environment, it's very hard because of the stripping out of resources in the state sector to be able to meet the needs of those children. So, for instance, I was talking to a dad just a few days ago, end of last week. He told me that he and his wife hadn't been away on holiday ever since their children were school age because they have 2 children who are neurodiverse, and they put all of their money into being able to provide those places for children. So my point is this: if Labour are intent on this policy, what you have to do is resource up the state sector before you resource down anything else. So parents, obviously, if they're spending a huge amount of their salaries on education, that's crippling them in other ways. And the impetus to be able to create other choices for them is great, but you've got to resource up the state sector before removing and tampering with anything else. And that means, of course, it ties into our next subject, as I remember you saying, Ruth, teachers and the recruitment of teachers. So we are so under-resourced in the state sector already. How are we going to deal with any more pressure without this resourcing up before resourcing down?
You said everything I was about to say. I'll just put it in slightly different language, maybe, that I'd have to make clear, first of all, colleagues, that independent schools make up just 4.25% of our sector in terms of number of pupils. I think we'd have to be clear about that. But everything Steve said, the SEND issue, a lot of our smaller private schools are focusing on SEND, and I like your phrase, Steve, atypical learners, learners who can't cope in the mainstream sector. And here again, the notion of parental choice. I'm sure Dr. Healy would agree, have no problem with parents who make this choice, who sacrifice, as you say, no holidays in order to send their children to these schools. So I think this VAT will have a critical impact on the schools that have been spoken about, which are not, inverted commas, eaten, or in our case, ample.
Thank you. Can I bring in Deborah Weston now? Deborah, you're associated with Naturally. We speak to you all the time about religious education in schools. But I know you've been a teacher as well lifelong teacher. This issue about teachers leaving the profession, there are, I read, vacancies reaching 2,800, which is a doubling in 3 years. Although there are 468,000 teachers in total, so it's a small proportion. But even so, there are now plans in the manifesto Labour is saying they want 6,500 new expert teachers so that maths graduates teach maths and so on. Can you just give me your reflection on the crisis in teacher recruitment and retention?
Yes, we have a serious issue across all the subject areas, not just religious education, but religious education was in a bad way in terms of recruitment and retention before we reached this particular crisis. So if I give you one statistic and tell you that 51% of the teachers who deliver religious education in the country now actually spend most of their timetable teaching a completely different subject, and will almost certainly are trained in that subject and receive their regular professional development in that subject. So we have a real issue here about, what do we do about that? Because there are about 16,000, by the way, teachers of RE. But I mentioned that 51%, so it's a small pool. So we have a massive shortage. Where are they going to come from? Now, Tim Hutchins will speak about this a bit later, but we have a baseline problem in that there aren't sufficient TRS graduates, so Theology and Religious Studies graduates, coming through to fill the space. So, we know that there's about between 10 and 12,000 graduates every year. Tim can probably update me on those figures. And about 10% of those go into some sort of education. We have a target. So, do your maths at maximum, 120 or so graduates per year. We need around 600 new teachers for religious education every year. So where are they coming from? So how do we solve this problem? We can't wave a magic wand and find these teachers from nowhere. So I think the key thing we've got to do, and there's some reference to this in the manifesto, is to create an expert workforce. And to do that, I think we need to train those teachers that are delivering RE. They need proper, systematic subject knowledge, subject pedagogy training funded so that properly and addressing all the right issues. And if we can boost those, we call them twos, teachers with other specialisms. So if we can boost those people, and we may even convert them to becoming passionate about religious education, not about their first subject. So I think that will be a really important thing to do.
Ask for your reflection on what the manifestos say about the curriculum. So there's more money that's going to be put into bursaries for teachers dealing with the science subjects, STEM subjects. People have mentioned physics and chemistry and maths. They need more specialists like this, but not when it comes to the arts, and not for religious education. No mention of it in any of the manifestos. What does that tell you about what all the parties are thinking of when they create their ideas for what the curriculum should look like in the future in schools? And we'll move on to universities in a moment with Tim and Lois. But what does it tell you, Deborah, about the priorities for politicians?
Well, I guess I don't think I was expecting to see specific references to subjects in the manifesto. So perhaps I started with lower expectations of that. But I think that I did notice that both the Lib Dems and the Labour Party are promising a review of some kind of the curriculum. And my goodness, it is so long overdue to have that review. We've been told also that it will include religious education if Labour are elected. So that's encouraging. So that review, I think, is crucial, and also review of assessment. I was involved in GCSE and A-level reform. The process started in 2015. So even if we start now, we'll be looking at 9 years of one particular set of GCSE and A-levels, which is patently ridiculous. It's not keeping up to date with what's going on in universities. It's not keeping up with what's going on in society. And we really need to make sure that our examination systems and assessments in general are fit for purpose in modern society.
Thank you. I want to bring in Tim Hutchins, Dr. Tim Hutchins from Nottingham and Dr. Lois Lee from Kent into the discussion now, and ask you a similar question, perhaps starting with you, Tim. The same question again. What do the manifestos tell you about how the parties are approaching education? In particular, the Tories talking about assessing the value of university degrees with a view to axing the ones that don't lead to high salaries at the end, and also the rise rise in interest in apprenticeships across the board, and how that fits in with an academic way of thinking at the moment. What message do you take away from looking at the manifestos and what they say about education in your sector?
As we know, and as was mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, education doesn't often come up as anyone's top 3 priority for deciding who they're going to vote for. Universities are even lower on the priority list than that. And when it comes to making tough decisions about universities, like, for example, should it be time to do something about raising tuition fees, that is beyond the bottom of the most unpopular policies you could think of suggesting. But we know that higher education is in crisis. The university sector is in a real state right now. And if you look at the manifestos, they all say something about higher education. And it seems to me that there is a very quiet battle going on between those manifestos about whether universities are good for our country or not. If you look at the Conservative manifesto and the Reform manifesto, they are seeing universities as, I would suggest, a negative force right now that should be shut down. The Conservatives are talking quite openly about wanting to close a lot of courses down. The Liberal Democrat, the Green manifestos are much more positive. The Labour manifesto is somewhere in between, but at least it's saying that a crisis is recognised and something needs to be done. We need to see some change and some tough decisions, I think, with the new government coming in to work out what are universities for? Do we actually want them? And if we want them to survive, where is the money going to come from? Because that's a decision that has been really kicked down the line year after year under the current system. We've run out of road.
Thank you, Lois. Just ask you to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a helpful summary. The universities are in crisis, but we're quite a long way down a list of other institutions that are in crisis. I've been interested to read that actually typically universities don't feature highly in elections, that they're not big vote winners or losers. Nationally, broadly, there's a view that universities are broadly good and they are supported. And there's been some interesting commentary on why it is that the Tory manifesto has taken this kind of quite critical view of higher education, which is, I think, really unusual. So I think the kind of interesting point is how unusual that is. One piece of analysis I saw said this is a sign of a defensive party that's looking to its own internal debates, and that's what this references, kind of concerns about woke universities and so on, that just aren't shared by the population at large. So they're seeing that as a bit of an own goal, really. Labour, I liked Tim's phrase about this kind of quiet battle that's going on. So it isn't at the forefront of the big conversations we're having, but it does matter a lot. And there are these kinds of clues in there. So this sort of concern about small courses that don't lead to good jobs, okay, that implicates the study of religion hugely, because that's pointing to the humanities subjects where, whether it's religious studies or studies of religion, they are really in the firing line. They already are, and they're a big part of this crisis. And I speak as someone who's been on the sharp end of that at the University of Kent, where philosophy, religious studies, and anthropology programs have just been closed. So, I find myself in Canterbury, which is not an insignificant location in terms of religious history, which now has no provision for this study. So this is already happening. It looks like the Tories would like to see more of that. And I think anyone who's interested in that expert task force should be worried about that. But I take a bit more heart than Tim does maybe about the Labour manifesto. I mean, as Deborah says, you wouldn't expect it to reference particular courses at school level, and that's true for universities as well. But they do talk about regulation, which is quiet, as Tim says, but it points to something that people in HE have noticed a lot in recent years, which is a real lack of policy, a lack of regulation, a lack of intervention, which sometimes is a policy. So George Osborne removed that cap on student numbers, talking about caps. And that's allowed a kind of rebalancing of the HE system that isn't working for anybody. So you end up with kind of very large universities that can't support their student learning. They can't house the students. Our university system is really significantly regional. It supports our regions. Every region should have a flourishing university. Removing the cap has kind of led to chaos in that. Then you have smaller institutions like the University of Kent that are losing students. So that imbalance it's a really kind of clear example of how a tiny bit of regulation that might not look very significant and isn't going to be headline in our manifestos has a really big impact on higher education. And so the few steps along, we as people who are interested in religious studies have to make those interpretations, but we get to a real attack on the study of religion in HE. Reversing that, reverse those steps, might lead to a more positive place.
We'll see if they listen, Lois. But I would like to bring you in on another subject. I know that Rosalind and Rudi, you've got hands up. We'll come to you in a moment. But with your other hat on, Lois, there's a lot of manifesto commitments on early years. So Labour is saying it will create nursery places. The Greens want Sure Start to come back. The Lib Dems want a tutoring guarantee for children before the age of 5. Do you welcome the emphasis on early years education?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought you were going to ask about expertise in atheism, which actually is a bit of the backdrop to what we're talking about. Perhaps we could come to that, because we are seeing a really changing worldview landscape in the UK, and I'm not sure that's been present in the kind of conversation we've had so far. If the polls are correct, we're looking to having our first atheist prime minister, and that's significant. And it's not a story of religious decline, which is how we've tended to think of it. It's a story of worldview change, and it means that our institutions need to make better space for expertise in worldviews more broadly. So there is a big issue. That's another one of my hats. But I would welcome discussion from other participants about that. One of the issues about the cap, lifting the cap in school level education, is about pluralism, which hasn't come up today. With so many young people now being non-religious themselves. So I'm not thinking about parents, thinking about the students themselves. What we may end up with that cap being lifted is a kind of de facto segregated system where you have religious schools and you have humanist dominated schools. I've just published an article with Dr. Anna Strahan and Rachel Shilliter about the way in which humanist ethoses are developed in school contexts, normally not formally or intentionally in any way, but that's a part of what's going on. So I think we really need to think about what the role of pluralism is in all levels of our education. I think that should be addressed. You asked me about kids. I've done the typical politicians type answer. I'm in election mode, as you can see. I have 2 young kids, which is what Ruth's alluding to. And I have a very straightforward answer to that, which is, yes, I'm glad there's attention being given to that. Talking about being at the sharp end of policies. Yeah, I mean, it's really horror. It's one of those things that you sort of understand on paper, but when you sort of see in practice the struggles that people go through in order, the impact of this, of neglected funding in these areas, and the kind of heroism of early years providers to support our kids.
I think there's been a lot of discussion about the independent schools VAT issue. And you'll see a lot of very heated discussion on social media, people sharing the average fees for independent schools and saying only the very rich could afford this absurd amount of money. The average fee for an independent school is basically exactly the same as the average fee for under 2s childcare in this country, which I think, separately from, as Rudi and others have said before, obviously there's a lot of range of fees in the independent school sector. But still, I think that the level of public response to the idea of somebody paying £10,000 a year or more for their fees, or that's what childcare costs. So that's perhaps time to do something about it.
Thank you. Just allowing, Rosal, do you want to make your point now? We just asked people to come in with points, reflections of what they've heard.
Thank you so much. I'd love to, if that's okay, just to briefly touch on the discussion here regarding, first of all, early years. It's wonderful that there is an increased focus on what's happening in early years across the country. I think from the Jewish perspective, I think both the Conservatives and Labour have looked at either the expansion of existing free school meals or provision of wraparound care at cost to the taxpayer. And within the Jewish community, there's been a real issue actually with the expansion of free school meals and the ability to provide them, to provide it at, with fully kosher food for the children at the amount that the government has set. And that's really impacted schools' budgets in order to be able to provide that. So that also has a big implication that isn't usually noticed or seen. And then the other piece that I'd like to just point out as well is that obviously religion is one of the protected characteristics. And when we talk about tolerance and faith and respect for others, I think the DFE consultation about the lifting of the cap has pointed out that actually forced integration at school level, particularly when it's against parental choice and doesn't acknowledge parental choice, doesn't actually accomplish the goals where we do want our children to be integrated members of society with respect for everyone and able to engage with everyone. And perhaps the way to address, the RE and the lack of focus on universities as well is to increase our students' ability to be able to engage in meaningful debate and meaningful discussion. And when we talk about the main parties looking to do curriculum reviews, perhaps that's something that we can be calling for, to really equip our young people to have meaningful discussion and meaningful debate and provide them with the safe places to do so. And for the faith communities, that means enshrining the place for faith schools.
I'll limit myself to one point, although the conversation's been so rich, I'd love to say more, but I won't. So Deborah talked about training for teachers, which is such an important point. And I note Labour wants to bring 6,500 more teachers into the state sector, which is a great aim. On recruitment and training, I would really like the independent sector to be able to do more here. I'd much rather be having discussions about that than about VAT. VAT, Labour thinks is going to raise 1.5 billion. It will probably raise, a bit under $1 billion if it's going to raise anything, which with a schools budget of 60 billion is probably not the key issue. If the independent sector could be more involved in training and recruitment of teachers to go into the state sector, that would be a far more transformational policy than quibbling about tax. So I'd be really, really happy if Labour would talk with the independent sector about something like what we can do on recruitment and training and implications that haven't taken it up.
One point I really wanted to add to this, which Ofsted has really recognized, is that it's created a subcategory for independent schools in its categorization of schools. I think the label of independent school is quite a generic label. It needs reviewing by the new government. It needs to create a category where independent community, where schools are totally not for profit. Schools have a lower sort of budget than state schools, have a different category, and that really needs to be tabled as either independent community or independent with religion, which Ofsted has now come up with, or perhaps independent in its own right, which is profit making.
Yes, I'll follow Rudi's great example and stick to one point. We haven't talked about quality here about in terms of education either, and I've seen in the manifesto references to raising standards and so on. And I just wanted to make the point that, of course, religious education doesn't have a national benchmark, such as the national curriculum, for example, and that's why the RE community has done what it does best and home grow its own solution. So the RE Council has promoted a national content standard for religious education in England, which is gathering support very strongly. Steve's trust, Oasis, is one of the recommending trusts, which is I'm very proud to have received that recommendation. But we really need to think about what we mean by high quality religious education in our modern society, and including make sure it's fit for children for their own communities, and also fit for work in the modern workplace. Lots of people really interested in that development, and Lord Billamori has been campaigning an RE Council campaign, working with NatTre on RE for work. So I just wanted to say that we mustn't lose touch with this idea about the importance of high quality, not just any provision. Of course, we want compliance with the law, but we must have high quality provision.
Following on from Rachel's point earlier, where she mentioned meaningful discussion and meaningful debate, And Caroline wants to say a word about the fifth priority for the Catholic Union, free speech on university campuses.
Yes, the Catholic Union did a survey last year about faith in higher education, and the survey found that people were in higher education were in the sector which was the worst for feeling comfortable about talking about their faith and being able to talk about their faith. So as a union, we're quite interested to see what the next government will be doing to uphold free speech in higher education. And we hope that the Office of Students will be strong on this and upholding the right to free speech, particularly around faith.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the final words with Steve and Lois, if I may. Steve, could you respond to what you've heard, but particularly Lois's point about society being very different now and how the education system needs to reflect that?
Yes, I'd love to pick up on that. I think we touched on curriculum, and the manifestos touch on curriculum. I think we should be looking at a different word. It's the word pedagogy. And I speak at a lot of educational conferences, and you often hear curriculum and pedagogy in the same sentence or on the same slide. And it's curriculum and pedagogy as though it's stuffed on the end, and it kind of matters, but nobody's really sure what it is anyway. Of course, a pedagogue, Greek term, was the person that led a child to learning. And I think before our curriculum, and particularly in light of everything that Lois was saying, as you've picked up, Ruth, we need an emphasis on pedagogy. How do children learn? How do we light a fire for them? If the child doesn't learn the way you teach, start teaching the way they learn. And I think this goes to the subject that I wanted to speak about at the end. And you said we get a chance to talk about SEN, special educational needs. So schools have behaviour policies. And I always think that school will have a behaviour policy and then an SEN policy. But behaviour is a communication. You can't deal with behaviours until you look at the drivers. So it is a special educational need. And if we're going to create this more inclusive education that everyone wants and tackle these issues like, the number of children that are persistently absent or ghost children or turn up and can't concentrate or don't concentrate and end up with endless fixed term exclusions and then they're finally excluded. What we've got to look at in our country, and I think it ties into everything Lois said about a curriculum being out of date, but I'd add it's not just the curriculum that's out of date. Our theory of education hasn't caught up with our modern understanding of brain science, child and adolescent development. So until we deal with the pedagogy, I think whatever we stick in the curriculum, we're still going to fail many children.
On that note, Steve, thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry we've run out of time. We could have carried on for a lot longer. But it was the first one. I hope you'll join us for the other briefings in the series, and thank you again.